what's the latest you can, like, where do you want to start? Actually, off air, we were talking about this whole Brad Treliving thing. Like the fact that, so he won't be on the stage if they make a selection, right?
I believe that's the
Why?
case. That was an initial ask from the Calgary Flames, not an ask, a demand, because for 3 more days, he's actually was technically still under contract with the Flames. And as everyone knows, when the season first ended, having made the decision to step away from the Flames, they didn't grant him permission to interview anywhere at all. So he was completely out of the mix for the Pittsburgh Penguins opening that ultimately ended up going to Kyle Dubas. And then only sort of after external pressure, some tweets from me, the Flames decided to relent and then ended up allowing him permission to speak with teams, which then turned into the Leafs. But the stipulation always was, we had you under contract until June 30th. You know our draft board. You're picking 28. We're picking 16. We don't want to be in a spot where you're wielding the knowledge that we paid you to acquire for someone else's draft floor. Mm-hmm. Now, the thing is, Kyle Dubas leaves the Leafs, goes to Pittsburgh, and is armed with all of the same knowledge, yet the Leafs didn't feel the need to say to him, hey, even though you know our amateur scouting list, and I'm sure, not accusing anyone of anything, it would be the exact thing I would do. Before he left, I'm sure it was like, hey, let me download every single file that I can get my hands on so I could take that information with me when I go. So, there's 2 different ways to look at it, as if, we've got complete trust in our process and our amateur scouts, and it's just one player off the board. This really isn't a big deal, but I also understand it from a Flames perspective in the sense that this is a guy that you've paid to be on your team for 10 years. And that's a lot of institutional knowledge to take to the other side of Canada to then potentially do something with.
I just think it's stupid. Like, people are going to talk regardless. Like, I mean, who's to stop somebody from texting him or calling him? Like that's my question. And I just think
one. That's why in theory it makes sense, but in execution and practicality, it doesn't.
It's like, I don't know, but nonetheless, we know he's a busy man, right? He's up to a lot. What's the latest? Where do you want to start? Nylander?
Sure. Yeah. The easiest way to explain it with Nylander is they've been in direct dialogue and conversation for the last little while here. Brad Treliving is pushing to get a deal done. That's, Austin Matthews, I think, is the sort of number 1 priority. But then the Matthews camp, at least as far as I can understand it, has in that they're going to slow play this process. They're not in any rush. And in fact, they want to see how this whole chessboard develops before making decisions on not just will Austin Matthews come back. That's sort of a foregone conclusion, and they've let the Maple Leafs know that. So there isn't really any concern on the Leafs part or Matthews part that this all, might go sideways. The point is, the Matthews camp wants to know what happens with Nylander. They want to see not just what happens, but what does he sign for? And they want to, be able to evaluate, hey, here's what the cap picture looks like. Austin Matthews wants to win, and he's got to find a number that allows the Toronto Maple Leafs to be competitive. And I think that's one of his priorities. It's not just getting paid. Of course, that's part of it, but making sure that you're in an environment that can enable and promote team success. So that's one thing that they're monitoring. And where I think it ultimately gets to on Nylander is, do the Toronto Maple Leafs have confidence that they can get a deal done? What does it look like? And if not, if they hit a dead end, if they hit a roadblock, I think there's enough scar tissue there with Brad Treliving watching Johnny Gaudreau 1 year ago walk to free agency for nothing. Johnny Gaudreau and William Nylander have the same agent. So that's certainly something to keep in mind here. Every negotiation is different. Every client has a different tenor. And the real difference, I think, between Johnny Gaudreau in Calgary and William Nylander in Toronto is that Nylander stay. And I think that was always a question for Gaudreau. But nonetheless, just important context to keep in mind in terms of the 30,000-foot view here on where the Leafs are heading this week.
I don't know why it just has that feel like Nylander's days could be numbered. I don't know if you feel the same way in some of the things you're hearing, but it's got that weird, eerie feel for me, at least.
I don't personally get those vibes, but I understand your thought process, because I think the truth is everyone has kind of looked at him how many, like, let's go back to like March. And the conversation was, well, if the Leafs or when they lose, to change up the core for William Nylander, he was just the foregone conclusion that everyone's looking at saying, this is the guy that's going to be the odd man out.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the case. First off, we've talked a lot about the surplus value that he has on his current deal. And then second, when you get to the playoffs, he was one of the few guys that actually showed up consistently year after year. That, you know, of all the players on the Toronto Maple Leafs, that's the guy whose fire I question the least.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's, and that's why it gets to the point of the whole core four conversation. And I'm always careful to believe everything I hear this time of year. Do you still think there's a potential? Maybe it's Nylander. Like, do you think there's still a potential they make a significant trade of one of those guys?
I think you have to allow for the possibility. Is it probable? No. Is it likely? Hell no. But it's a greater than 1% chance that William Nylander gets to the point where he's too expensive for the Leafs to keep.
Yeah.
And you know, that's what they're in the process of determining right now. But I would say from the initial discussions that have been had to this point, I don't have anyone waving any red flag saying that this could potentially be an issue.
So like behind the scenes, like what's that conversation looking like? Like, to me, it's pretty clear. Like, hey, what do you want? This is what I want, right? And I think there's a point where the Leafs are like, this is the bar we're willing to go to, and that's it. Am I correct in saying that?
I mean, I think every negotiation for almost every player outside of like Connor McDavid, that's like kind of that's the tenor of it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, everyone has a price and a ceiling that, you know, if the ask gets outlandish, you just try and find another path or move in another direction.
Yeah, it just that's my wonder again as we get closer and closer to July 1. It's like, I mean, how much talking do you need to have between both sides when it comes to Nylander and Brad Treliving is the question, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure they're asking questions too. Who's going to be here?
Yeah.
Obviously, we know Sheldon Keefe's coming back, but is Austin Matthews definitely coming back? What are your plans for John Tavares? What happens with Mitch Marner 1 year from now? How do you envision reshaping the defense core of this team? Who's going to be in net? If I were a player signing a long-term deal, those are the types of things I'd be asking and saying, look, you don't have to show me your whole master plan, but what do you think? Like, this is a totally new outlook and view for the Toronto Maple Leafs with the change in management that's part of the reason why you're getting a little bit of a slow play from the Matthews camp, because they're saying, we need to wrap our heads around all this. We want to understand exactly where this is heading, because these are really crucial years in the careers of all these players.
Personally, I think it's lunacy. And I don't know if you agree that, you know, I think you look back at the misfortunes in the Stanley Cup playoffs to come back with the same core players. I don't know if you feel the same way. Like, it's crazy to me, no?
I agree, because I think ramming your head against the wall
pretty much
8 times in a row and expecting something to be different, you know, you can try and bull your way through the wall. I just don't know that works. And I think there's more evidence to suggest that the alternative and changing out pieces would be appropriate. Here's the problem, is that we're also, you know, operating in a world that is difficult, in the sense that, like, look at the Leafs and where they want to get to. Like, let's say they make a decision and say, William Nylander, too expensive. Well, you've now then, if you're going to trade him, yes, great value on this contract, but not an exorbitant amount of trade value, because you're dealing with a situation where the team needs to spend assets to acquire the player and then sign him. So, like, let's take a look at the Connor Hellebuck situation in Winnipeg and how that's unfolded. There are a lot of teams that would love to get their hands on Connor Hellebuck, but maybe only like 2 or 3 that can actually afford him.
Yeah.
And so Nylander teams, it's different, I think, at the forward position, where there's obviously more teams that are willing to spend on the position, but to the point where there are some teams that would carve out space and go and trade players away in order to get their hands on someone like Nylander. But in order to pull that off, there's movement to get rid of guys, then the pieces you need to move to get him, and then the capital commitment and cap commitment to then sign him long term, that it makes it a really expensive proposition. And so what I think the Leafs have, more than anything, I think they're all curious and sort of, they've been asking, I'm sure, the same questions that you and I have and everyone else in the fan base. What can we do to change this up? But I think the calculation that they keep coming back to is, if we move one of these guys, how do we actually make the Toronto Maple Leafs better? And so when you back yourself into that corner, you start to realize maybe what we have now is better than what we could get out there.
Again, there's so many moving parts. And I think you look specifically at the draft. Like, what is your expectation in terms of what could potentially get done? Or are they sort of tied until they find out more on Nylander and Matthews here?
Well, see, this is why it's actually been difficult to really handicap the Nylander situation, is because Brad Treliving, from the managers that I've talked to around the league, has been making calls and has been checking in on the prices of some high-priced players on the market. And so, my first ask is, well, if Brad Treliving is out there kicking tires, is he just looking for a price check in aisle 5? Or is he saying, look, we may have to do something here and we may have some cap space? I tend to believe, at least from the people that I've spoken to, that it's more just, this is typical Brad Treliving being Brad Treliving and calling every person about every single asset out there to understand what market prices are, which I think is smart. And I don't have any indication yet that they've ever really seriously entered into talks with another team about a significant piece yet.
Defenseman, is that what we're looking at here?
At some point, I think you have to. And I think it's going to be interesting to see kind of what little cap space the Leafs have, how they prioritize rebuilding or reshaping their defense core.
Yeah, because that's a big question for me. And again, you like to draw, some parallels, especially Brad Treliving, what he did in Calgary, right? And right away, I think Calgary, I think Philadelphia. I mean, what's the likelihood something could brew here with team, let's say a Toronto and a Calgary, maybe?
I think there's a possibility. I think Brad Treliving has asked about the prices of some of those players just because he knows them so well.
Exactly. Yeah.
I do think he's, checked in with the Flyers on some of their guys and go down the list, whether it's, teams in the West. Like, he's been all over the place. And that's why I don't have any indication yet that he's, sort of honed in on anyone in particular. That I still think, the vast likelihood here is that the Leafs end up bringing back the core 4 and then sort of taking care of Samsonov and nibbling around the edges on the rest of the roster.
I think it's a definition of insanity, but nonetheless, you look at some of the guys who are pending UFAs. Anything new on O'Reilly, guys like Luke Shen?
Nothing new to my knowledge. I think the Leafs sort of have an understanding of where everyone is, like what their ballpark price is. I think they've gotten the understanding that as much as Ryan O'Reilly liked his time in Toronto and would, leave the door open to coming back, the truth is that he's likely in a neighborhood that the Leafs can't afford. Like, we're talking north of $5 million on the AAV, and he's not at the point in his career. He's not Mark Giordano where he's 38 and can take a hometown discount.
Exactly.
He's way younger, another contract to cash in, can't leave, $20 million on the table. It just doesn't happen.
See, my theory with this team is like they're jammed up. Like, I think you look at the capital, what they have to trade. If it's not a Matthew Nyes, it's selling low on a Nick Robertson. That's my wonder. It's like everybody
really selling low though
on Nick Robertson,
or is Nick Robertson just a prospect that in any other market, because they have a stable of actual prospects and his last name happens to be Robertson, whose brother is a star? Like, if this is just another guy that you ripped the nameplate off and named him something, Alberga, would we be having this conversation?
Probably not. But, from the previous administration, they really, really like the player.
I mean,
I get it.
Look, I think they liked the player, but I also think they watched what everyone else watched, which was got to the NHL, didn't have the ability to, sort of produce consistently. And I don't want to say they soured on him, but it's like the realities are the reality. Like, that
gets hurt a lot too.
Yeah, that's another part of it too.
Yeah.
So sell low, I mean, or is it just selling?
Does he have value?
Not a ton.
Yeah. Because, there was whispers that Philadelphia liked him in the past, no?
I hadn't heard the Flyers, but that's the type of player that they would seize on, or any smart team should, in the idea that you find a player in an organization that, times run out, needs a change of scenery, ready to move on, whatever that may be. And if he has some kind of pedigree, just take a look and see if you find something you like.
Getting back to the point, just to wrap here, like, what do they have to give up? If it's not going to be a core 4 guy, what do they have to give up to say get a top 4 defenseman? That's my question.
Well, they still have a first round pick, and it may not be all that exciting at 28. I think a lot of teams this year, Nick, see a big drop off in value after 11. I mean, look, they have other pieces on their roster that they could move if they want to. But it all depends on how creative you want to be and what kind of stamp Brad Treliving wants to put on this team. And by the way, you mentioned defense. Like, another way to improve this team could be in net. And not to say Samsonov didn't have a great year. He did. But he's got to go out and do it again.
True.
And you're making a bigger bet on him this time. What about a decent guy to play 1B and in tandem?
What's wrong with Joe Wall?
I mean, I guess he could. My question, and they like him. They're high on him. My point is, you know, you don't have to devote assets there, but I also think maybe not the worst idea to do that.
If you can find an upgrade, for sure. And my wonder too is, like, you know, even the Aiden Hill contract, like, does that have any sort of, you know, does that have any say on what happens here with Ilya Samsonov? Because I think there gets to a point where he just wants too much money too, right?
I personally don't think that's going to be an issue.
Okay.
I don't think he's as high a number as Aiden Hill. He doesn't have the Stanley Cup, of course.
True.
And more than that, like, I think there's still a little bit of a prove it factor. Samsonov RFA years that you're buying, not UFA years, and that makes a difference too.
What are these events like for you? Like, how often you on your phone? Do your fingers hurt? Or
I mean, you see me. I
think it's just
check
your
my
wife.
phone during. Yeah, no. As I check my phone during the show, it's never to be rude. It's just like I'm always someone saying something about something. So whether it's on Twitter, an alert that you know, you look at the coaching staff in Ottawa, DJ Smith, they're coming back next year. That's what Pierre Dorian just said. So you're kind of just filtering, processing information. People are texting, calling.
Like, how many texts are you getting, like, during a draft, or, like, you know, when something trade deadline?
A couple hundred.
I always wonder, man.
Yeah, a couple hundred.
That's why you ghost me all the time.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Makes a lot of sense.